Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the specifics of a key government document.
That's right. We're looking closely at the text itself.
We are doing a deep dive into Executive Order 14167. It was signed January 20, 2025, and the title is Clarifying the Military's Role in Protecting the Territorial Integrity of the United States.
Quite a title.
It is. And for our sources today, we're sticking strictly to the official text from the White House website, plus the details published in the Federal Register. That's volume 90, page 8613 from January 30, 25.
And we also confirmed its publication on Wikisource, just for cross-referencing the text availability.
Exactly. So our mission here is pretty straightforward. We want to unpack this specific executive order, understand its stated purpose, the policy it sets out, and crucially, the implementation directives it gives.
And we're focusing only on what the document says, particularly about the military's role as it's described right there in the order.
Understanding these orders, I mean, it's key to seeing how government actions are actually outlined, right?
Absolutely. It shows the direct instructions given to federal entities. Sticking to the language used is, well, essential for an accurate picture based on the source.
Okay, let's unpack this thing. Executive Order 14167, signed by President Donald J. Trump, January 2025.
And officially published just 10 days later, January 30th, in the Federal Register.
Right. So let's jump into Section 1, Purpose. This is where the order basically explains why it's being issued. What reasons does the text itself give?
Okay, Section 1 starts by framing it around the president's responsibility. It mentions being chief executive and commander-in-chief and the duty to protect U.S. sovereignty and territorial integrity along the borders, calls it a most solemn responsibility.
So starting with the constitutional role.
Exactly. Then it brings in history. It refers to what it calls the long and well-established role of the armed forces.
And doing what specifically?
In securing borders against, and I'm quoting here, threats of invasion, against unlawful forays by foreign nationals, and against other transnational criminal activities. Then the text asserts that these kinds of threats, these threats against our nation's sovereignty, continue today. And because of that, it says military participation is essential.
So historical precedent leading to present necessity.
And then there's a very direct statement. It explicitly declares, quote, a national emergency currently exists along the southern border of the United States.
A declared national emergency right there in the purpose section.
Yes. And it follows that up by listing the specific threats that, according to the order, justify this action. It cites unchecked, unlawful mass migration and the unimpeded flow of opiates across our borders.
And how does it characterize those threats?
It says they endanger safety and security and encourage lawlessness. So the order presents itself as acting in accordance with the duty to protect sovereignty and territorial integrity against these specific dangers.
And you mentioned it uses the term forms of invasion later.
Yes, that language appears later in the text, specifically in Section 3 when detailing USNORTHCOM's mission, referring back to these types of activities. So Section 1 really lays the groundwork, the justification, as presented by the order itself.
Okay, so that's the why, according to the document. Let's move from the justification to the actual policy. Section 2, policy. What does the order establish as the core policy regarding the military here?
Section 2 is pretty short and very direct. It states, and this is a direct quote, it is the policy of the United States to ensure that the armed forces of relayed states prioritize the protection of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the United States along our national borders.
Prioritize. That seems like the key word there.
It is. The text makes it clear the policies for the armed forces to make this a priority mission along the borders. It's signaling where this should rank, in terms of military focus.
All right. Purpose justifies. Policy prioritizes. Okay. Section 3, implementation. This is often where, the rubber meets the road. What specific actions does the order tell the Secretary of Defense to actually do?
Yeah, Section 3 gets very specific with directives for the Secretary of Defense. First off, within 10 days of the order's effective date, the Secretary has to revise the Unified Command Plan.
Okay, and remind us, the Unified Command Plan is?
It's basically the top-level document that assigns missions and geographic responsibilities to the major military commands, like CNTCOM, or in this case, NORTHCOM.
Got it. So revising that plan means changing command missions.
Precisely. And this revision is specifically directed to assign a new mission to United States Northern Command, USNORTHCOM. That's the command responsible for North America.
And what mission is NORTHCOM assigned, according to the text?
The text spells it out very clearly. The mission assigned is to, quote, seal the borders and maintain the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of the United States by repelling forms of invasion, including unlawful mass migration, narcotics trafficking, human smuggling and trafficking, and other criminal activities.
Wow. Seal the borders and repelling forms of invasion. It's a very direct military language assigned to NORTHCOM.
It is. The order mandates putting that specific mission using that exact language into a foundational military planning document.
Okay, what else is in Section 3?
Second, it directs that on the order's effective date, new requirements have to be added to other major military planning guides, the contingency planning guidance, and the guidance for the employment of the force.
And these guides shape how the military plans for things.
Yes, they shape planning for potential scenarios and how forces are actually used. The order adds specific requirements here, too.
Like what?
Like a level 3 planning requirement for USNORTHCOM. This is for that mission of sealing borders and repelling those forms of invasion we just listed.
Level 3 planning. What does that generally mean?
Typically, level 3 involves detailed planning by the command, developing courses of action, but it doesn't automatically mean forces are committed or execution orders are imminent. It's serious planning, though. And the order specifies the commander's estimate for this plan is due within 30 days.
Okay, so detailed planning required quickly. Anything else?
Yes, also a campaign planning requirement for USNORTHCOM. This is for, quote, steady state southern border security, seal the border, and maintain security by repelling forms of invasion. Again, listing the same activities.
Campaign planning sounds more long-term.
It usually implies sustained, ongoing efforts rather than just a contingency plan. So it suggests this mission is seen as an enduring one.
Interesting.
And one last thing in this section. The guidance must also require continuous assessments of all available options to protect the sovereign territory from mass unlawful entry and impingement on our national sovereignty and security by foreign nations and transnational criminal organizations.
So ongoing analysis of options, too.
Right. So Section 3, just reading the text, lays out concrete steps, change the command plan, assign this very specific seal and repel mission to NORTHCOM using the invasion framing, and mandate both detailed contingency and long-term campaign planning, plus continuous assessment.
That really does break down the operational directives. Okay, let's quickly cover Section 4, the general provisions. This is usually the standard legal stuff, right? But are there key takeaways here about the order's scope or limits, just based on what's written?
Yeah, it has the usual boilerplate, but it's important. It clarifies the order doesn't interfere with the existing authority of other agencies or the budget functions of the Office of Management and Budget, standard stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It also states implementation has to be consistent with applicable law and subject to the availability of appropriations, which is, a necessary caveat. Actions depend on existing law and funding.
So it acknowledges legal and budget constraints.
As stated in the order itself, yes. And critically, there's language saying the order, quote, is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law or in equity by any party against the United States, its departments, officers, etc.
Meaning you can't sue the government based solely on this order's text to demand some action or benefit.
Essentially, yes. That's what that kind of provision usually means. So these provisions frame the order legally and practically, defining its limits as written.
Okay, so we've gone through the stated purpose, the core policy, those very specific implementation directives for defense and NORTHCOM, and the general provisions. Thinking about everything we've just pulled directly from the source texts, what details or directives in Executive Order 14167 really stand out most to you, the listener? There's quite a bit there.
Well, if you connect the dots from the different sections, the core action that Executive Order 14167 lays out is pretty clear from the text. The document, it explicitly defines certain border activities like unlawful mass migration, drug trafficking. It labels them forms of invasion.
Right, that specific framing.
Exactly. And then it formally directs the military, specifically assigning USNORTHCOM, through changes to major military plans, the mission to seal the borders and actively plan to repel these specific activities.
And this is all presented as flowing from the justifications in Section 1.
Yes, the order presents it as a direct consequence of the stated policy to prioritize military border protection, and that declared national emergency along the southern border mentioned in the purpose section.
All right, so to quickly recap our deep dive today, we looked at Executive Order 14167. We examined its stated purpose, which is grounded in a declared national emergency and specific threats cited in the text. We saw the policy it establishes, which prioritizes the military's role in border protection.
Right. The prioritization is key.
And we detailed off the specific implementation steps directed at the Secretary of Defense and U.S. and NORTHCOM, the planning, the mission assignment, the specific language used like seal and repel, all drawn straight from the official documents.
So maybe a final thought, reflecting purely on the language and directives within this document itself. Consider the specific choice to label activities like unlawful migration and drug trafficking as forms of invasion, and then formally assigning a military combatant command, USNORTHCOM, the mission to seal the borders and repel them. Just thinking about the implications of using that language and assigning that mission to that type of command, as explicitly laid out in the text of this executive order, gives you a lot to consider.